Welcome to lecture 11 of the Theaetetus. Today we'll be talking about knowledge is perception. So the Theaetetus, as I've mentioned before, is one of my favorite books. It is my favorite book that Plato wrote. I mean, there are really some close seconds. I love the Republic, I love the Phaedo. But the Theaetetus, I think, has so many interesting arguments in it that it is well worth studying. So let's go ahead, we'll jump in, we'll have an introduction. And we have referred to the little numbers on the side of the margins for quite a while, and I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about those. Those are known as Stephanos numbers. They refer to the sections and pages in Henri Estienne's edition of Plato's works that were published in Geneva in 1578. So what has happened is those numbers have come to be the authoritative way to refer to particular passages in Plato's works. So as you're working on your papers, when you cite a particular passage, you want to make sure that you don't give the page number in your edition, but you give the Stephanos numbers. This allows people in different versions, different publications of Plato's Republic to easily find the passages. I have over here on the side an original copy of Plato's works published by Henri Estienne. This copy, interestingly, was owned by John Adams, and so if you can look up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see John Adams' signature there. So that's what that looked like. So in terms of the Theaetetus, it is a book that a lot of contemporary philosophers continue to refer back to for its presentation of some arguments that continue to have a lot of contemporary relevance. Now, we're going to talk about this when we get to the particular arguments, but in the early part of the 20th century, Wittgenstein found some parallels in the Theaetetus to some of his arguments that he was developing. And there's a number of contemporary thinkers that continue to look back to the Theaetetus to find inspiration. So the main question in the Theaetetus is, what is knowledge? This is something that has engaged a lot of contemporary philosophers trying to work out an account of knowledge, and we'll see how that works out. There's an introduction to the Theaetetus. That is the stage setting. It introduces our figures, Theodorus and Theaetetus. Theodorus is a very well-known mathematician, a geometer, and Theaetetus is a younger mathematician in training. Theaetetus has made some important discoveries. There is some discussion of Theaetetus' discoveries in the ancient world. We're not going to talk about those. But Theaetetus is someone who's presented as incredibly brilliant, talented, and an able mind to engage Socrates in dialectic. So after an initial discussion, they talk more about, they begin talking about whether episteme and sophia are the same. Episteme is the word used for knowledge, and sophia is the word for wisdom or expertise. The examples given earlier to that discussion, to 146a, are examples of a body of expertise. Typically, geometry, astronomy, harmonics, and so on. These are typically taken as sophia. And so the question is whether episteme and sophia are the same. Now, Socrates, remember, wants an answer of what knowledge is in terms of this model answer he provides, that clay is earth mixed with water. So this is an analysis in a way of clay. It tells us what its definition, what its essence is. And Socrates thinks that similarly we should be able to give an analysis of what episteme is. So we have Theaetetus starting off with his attempt to give an answer of what episteme or knowledge is. And Theaetetus says, a man who knows something perceives what he knows. And the way it appears at the present, at any rate, is that knowledge is simply perception. Theaetetus' view here, we can say K equals P, knowledge equals perception. That a man who knows something perceives what he knows. That knowledge is simply perception. Okay, now this thesis should seem a little odd to readers of the dialogue at this point. I mean, people are already familiar with Plato's arguments in the Phaedo and in the Republic that knowledge, true knowledge, comes from knowledge of the forms. And we got the argument in the Republic that there's a difference between opinion and knowledge. And this is part of the explanation for why only philosophers should rule, because only philosophers have knowledge. Now, the Theaetetus is taken as being written after the Republic, so this is more Plato's mature, developed view. So for readers of Plato who are familiar with this should be odd. But it should also be odd internally to the dialogue, because both Theodorus and Theaetetus are mathematicians. And so you would think that they would be sensitive to the idea that there's more to knowledge than simply what's grasped by perception. But this is a case in which most likely Plato wants to set up what he's about to do. He's going to set up a comparison between Theaetetus' claim that knowledge is perception and some very famous claims made by some other philosophers of that time. Now, just a little comment on this thesis that knowledge is perception. So the Greek word for perception there is to indicate sensory perception, and we'll see how this develops in a little bit in the remaining part of the reading that we're doing for today. The other thing about knowledge is perception is that what we know about knowledge is when you know something, that thing is true. So you can't know things that are false. And so what the thesis that knowledge is perception has going for it is the idea that when you perceive something, that thing is present, it's there. It's not in a way, as we'll see in a minute, it's not in a way an illusion. There is something that you're perceiving. So contemporary epistemologists talk about this in terms of knowledge is factive. That is, if you know a fact, that fact is true. So if you know, for example, some proposition P, then you can infer that P is true. The other thing we can note about knowledge is perception is that this is an empiricist thesis, that knowledge is restricted to the realm of things that you can perceive. So in a way, knowledge is restricted to what information you can get from your senses. Now what Plato is going to do here is he's going to link this claim that knowledge is perception with two other well-known claims at that time. He's going to link it with Protagoras' view that man is the measure, and here we have a picture of allegedly what Protagoras would have looked like. So Protagoras says, man is the measure of all things, of the things which are, that they are, and of the things which are not, that they are not. Protagoras is known as a relativist, one of the first relativists. As we'll see, some of the doctrines that Plato is concerned to rebut here are just forms of relativism. Plato also links this doctrine with Heraclitus' doctrine that everything is in flux. And so we are going to refer to these claims as K equals P, knowledge is perception, MM, man is the measure of all things, and flux, shorthand for everything is in flux. And Plato claims that these three doctrines are at root the same. What we'll get really is an argument that they're interconnected. And then Plato wants to rebut these arguments. So after talking about the doctrines of Protagoras and Heraclitus for a while, Plato turns to develop this in more detail. And he offers what is here referred to as the twin theory of perception. So I want to look at this passage on 156a through c. I'm going to read it and then let's talk about it a little bit. So Plato begins, he says, their starting point is this: the universe is change and nothing else. So this is the Heraclitean doctrine of the flux. There are two kinds of change, each unlimited in number, the one having the power of acting and the other having the power of being acted on. So the power of acting here is a power that is attributed to objects. So if for example, if a person sees a white stone, Plato is thinking here that the stone, in a way, has a power of acting. Remember back to early on in the lectures where we talked about this ancient theory of perception, where they thought in some sense there were kind of rays coming out of perceptual objects that sort of hit the eye. And so you could, in a way, directly see sort of the qualities of the eye. Now there's something like that going on here. It's going to be explained a little differently. So to repeat, Plato says there are two kinds of change, each unlimited in number, the one having the power of acting and the other the power of being acted on. From their intercourse and their friction against one another, there comes to be offspring, unlimited in number, but coming in pairs of twins, of which one is the perceived thing and the other a perception, which is on every occasion generated and brought to birth through the perceived thing. So the twin theory of perception here has it that when the eye, for example, and a perceived thing somehow or another interact from their friction together, they generate a perception which is in the mind, but there's also the other pair of the twin, the perceived object. He continues, now we have names for the perceptions of the following sort: seeing, hearing, smellings, feelings of cold, feelings of heat. Also, what are called pleasures, pain, desires, fears, and others. The nameless ones are unlimited in number, but those which have been given names are extremely numerous. On the other side, the appropriate class of perceived things shares a common origin with a set of perceptions, colors of every kind with scenes of every kind, sounds with hearings in the same way, and the other perceived things with other perceptions coming into being from the same origin. Now, there's a lot you could say about the twin theory of perception, but we don't want to get sort of down into the weeds here. What we want to do is highlight that on the twin theory of perception, perception is a relation between an experiencing subject and an object that gives rise to a private sensation that's in the subject. This sensation isn't something that's in the world, so you can't speak of perceptual qualities about being out there in the world. So this is something that Plato highlights later on. So if you look at 157a, he says, we must take it that nothing is hard, hot, or anything just by itself. So these perceived qualities aren't like in objects. There's not a white stone. There is an object that when it interacts with sight generates a perception of whiteness. So he continues in 157a, sort of halfway through that paragraph. He says, it isn't true that something is a thing which acts before it comes into contact with the thing which is acted on by it, nor that something is a thing which is acted on before it comes in contact with the thing which acts on it. And what acts when it comes into contact with one thing can turn out a thing which is acted on when it bumps into something else. So the view here is getting kind of difficult to state. The idea is that the act of perception in a way creates these private objects. And that's, in a sense, what we have direct access to in perception. Since the world is changing constantly on this Heraclitean doctrine, these objects themselves are constantly changing. So this is what he says there on 157b. The upshot of all this is that, as we've been saying since the beginning, nothing is one thing just by itself, but things are always coming to be for someone. We should exclude be from everywhere. Not that we haven't been forced to use it many times, even recently, by habit or lack of knowledge. But we oughtn't to, according to the wise people, nor ought we to admit something, someone's my, this or that. We ought rather to use expressions that conforms to the nature of things, and speak of them as coming to be, undergoing production, ceasing to be, and altering. Because if anyone brings things to a standstill by what he'll say, he'll be easy to refute in doing that. So, the Heraclitean idea is things are constantly changing. Your perception is constantly changing. So you can never say things are this way. You have to say things continue to change. Now, this is an idea that later Greek skeptics are going to return to. They're going to return to the themes of the relativity of perception and notice that, how can we judge that things are a certain way when perception depends upon the conditions in the observer and the conditions in the world, and those are constantly changing. So we're going to want to see how Plato answers this challenge from the twin theory of perception. One of the things that immediately happens is that Theaetetus raises the puzzle about dreaming. So you get this idea that when you dream, you're in touch with objects that are unreal. And so Plato says, well, on this Heraclitean view, right, these objects are still real. They're there right before you. So let's look at this passage on 158c. Plato says they're talking about dreams. What evidence one would be able to point to if someone asked at this very moment whether we're asleep and dreaming everything we have in mind, are awake and having a waking discussion with each other? Theaetetus responds, it's difficult to see what kind of evidence you could point to because all the features of the two states correspond exactly like counterparts. So Plato doesn't really respond to this other than to use it as an illustration for the Heraclitean view that in dreams too we're acquainted with perceptual objects. And in virtue of being acquainted with those objects are real. And so we have on the table Theaetetus' view that knowledge is perception, Protagoras' view that man is the measure of all things, that appearance is reality, this relativistic claim, and then Heraclitus' view that everything is in flux. And so they begin to raise some objections to this claim. These are superficial objections, and we'll see why they're superficial in a moment. So the first thing Plato notes is that the thesis that man is the measure of all things implies that there's no differences in wisdom. So he says, for example, in 161d, what else can we say to Theodorus? We're asked to suppose that whatever anyone judges by means of perception is true for him, that no one is better at discriminating someone else's experience than he is, or more authoritative in investigating whether someone else's judgment is correct or false. That, on the contrary, as we've said several times, each person is himself, the only one who can judge the things he does judge, and they're all correct and true. But if that's to be so, then how on earth can it be the case that Protagoras is wise, so that he can justly think himself fit to be a teacher of others at high fees, whereas we're more ignorant and have to go on to his lessons, though each of us is himself the measure of his own wisdom? So the point here is like, why would you pay Protagoras to be a teacher if, according to his view, everyone is equally wise? Now, Socrates is going to initially respond to this and say, in a way, this isn't fair because it appeals to popular opinion or popular prejudice. I think we're going to get a little bit of a better reply when we look at Protagoras' speech. So the second objection that I want to talk about here with the superficial objections is this idea that we can have knowledge by memory. And this is a problem for the view that knowledge is perception, because the thought is that when you are remembering something, you're not perceiving it. And so Socrates develops this, and it seems to be a problem. And then we have Protagoras' speech, where he replies to some of these objections. So if you look over on 166b, you have Protagoras' reply to the objection that there's knowledge by memory. So he says, to begin with, do you think anyone is going to concede to you that when one is no longer experiencing something, one can have present in one a memory of that thing, which is itself an experience of the same sort as the original one? So here Protagoras seems to be saying that this objection that there is no knowledge by memory, if knowledge is perception, misunderstands how he is using the word perception. He wants to use it in a more inclusive way, in terms of a seeming or an experience. And certainly we do have memorial experiences. We do remember, for example, what we had for breakfast, and oftentimes that involves recalling, something that is like the experience of seeing what you had for breakfast, though that's in the memory, of course. Next, Protagoras turns to address this concern that there's no differences in wisdom. And he says, basically, that he's using wisdom here in a different sense, not in the sense of having more true beliefs rather than false beliefs, but in the sense of having the power to affect a change in a person. So he says on 166d, for example, right, that I do apply the word wise to precisely this sort of person. Anyone who can effect a change in one of us, to whom bad things appear and are, and make good things both appear and be for him. So he's thinking that a physician here may be wise because the physician has the power to change what appears bitter for a person and change it to what appears pleasant. And this is especially useful and beneficial in the case where good food appears bitter and bad food appears sweet to the person. So the physician is benefiting the person. Right? So technically, right, this is a way for Protagoras to get around this objection, to talk about wisdom in terms of power and in terms of benefit rather than in terms of having more true than false beliefs. The last thing I want to point out is Protagoras' reply to Socrates at the end of his speech. So he says it's quite unreasonable that someone who professes to be concerned about virtue should spend his time doing nothing but behaving unjustly in argument. Seems reasonable. Behaving unjustly in this sort of pursuit is what one is doing when one fails to keep separate the time one spends in controversy and the time one spends in dialectic. So we want to highlight what's this difference between controversy and dialectic. In controversy, one may joke and trip people up as much as one can, but in dialectic, one should be serious and help the person one is talking to, showing up to him only those of his mistakes where his tripping up was his own fault are due to the company he used to keep. So the distinction here, the term dialectic is one that Plato invents. And it means an investigation of the truth of some matter. And the contrast here between controversy and dialectic, you might think of the controversy between watching something on, say, Fox News, where the commentators are trying to trip one another up and score points, as opposed to what we could think of as a philosophical investigation of a particular claim. For example, if we're investigating environmental policy, there's a way of engaging people in conversation where it's just a contest. There's not a serious investigation of the issue. But there's another way of interacting with individuals where it's an exploration of the evidence and the arguments. And what Plato and Protagoras and Socrates are all sort of advocating here is this idea that we should be engaged in dialectic and not controversy. So we turn now to a more serious engagement with Protagoras. I want to point you to a passage on 170c. So here Socrates says, well then, how are we to deal with your theory, Protagoras? Should we say that people always judge things which are true? Or that they sometimes judge things which are true and sometimes things which are false? Because from both alternatives it follows, I think, that they don't always judge things which are true, but judge both truths and falsehood. Ask yourself, Theodorus, whether you or any of Protagoras' followers would be willing to contend that no one person ever believes of another that he's stupid and makes false judgments. So Plato is presenting an argument that we can put this way. First claim is that either truth is relative or not. Second claim, if truth is not relative, then Protagoras' view is wrong. After all, if truth is not relative, then it's straightforwardly Protagoras' claim that man is the measure of all things, that appearance is reality, that truth is relative, is wrong. The third claim is where it sort of gets interesting. The third claim is, I think, more interesting. So if truth is relative, then Protagoras' view is wrong for those who take it to be wrong. So remember, Protagoras is claiming man is the measure. So if you think that his view is wrong, then given Protagoras' view, then since you're the measure, Protagoras' view is wrong. So either, right, the conclusion is, so either Protagoras' view is wrong or it's wrong for those who take it to be wrong. Now, this is a charge that Plato thinks that even Protagoras himself, right, needs to accept given his claim. So the real problematic claim for Protagoras is three. Premise one makes a claim about absolute truth, straightforwardly. So you would say, right, it's absolutely true that either truth is relative or it's not. Protagoras wouldn't agree to that. He would think, well, look, my claim is that truth is relative to everyone. So either truth is relative or not is itself relative. But the problem comes in with Protagoras is sort of applying the view to other people. If the idea is that truth is relative applies to everyone, and this means something like, what an individual judges to be is true, then on his own view, Protagoras' view will be wrong for those who judge it to be wrong. Now the concern with that is that it lacks a kind of objectivity that should be interesting for individuals. That if it's merely relative, then why should one worry about it? Now we'll see later some other refutations of Protagoras. Another way to sort of see this is Plato is pointing out that there is a kind of self-referential incoherence to the claim that truth is relative. If the claim is intended to be a universal objective claim, then of course it undermines itself. So it can't be understood that way. It has to be understood as itself being a kind of a relative claim. But if it is indeed just a relative claim, then why should we worry about it? Okay, so let's move on to the digression. The digression is really interesting, and I encourage you to read it. It's fun. So before we get into talking about the views of the digression and sort of what is going on in the digression, I want to note the buildup to the digression. So let's look at this passage 172a to b. So the conversation at this point just got done with this argument that Protagoras' view has this internal incoherence to it. So let's step back for a little bit and look at the paragraph right before that. So Socrates says, this is 171e, and Socrates says here, the theory stands up best in the version in which we sketched it a while ago. It goes like this. Most things actually are for each person the way they seem to him. For instance, hot, dry, sweet, or anything of that sort. Okay, so that's an interesting, what Socrates is saying here. Well, look, Protagoras is not a foolish person. He's certainly tracking some feature of reality, and what he's tracking is that judgments about, whether something hot or dry or sweet or cold, good tasting, bad tasting, those really do depend upon the individual person's perception, and they're relative in this way. But then notice what he says. But if there are any questions on which it will concede that one person is superior to another, it will be about what's healthy or unhealthy. It would be prepared to say that not every creature knows what is healthy for itself and is capable of curing itself. On the contrary, here, if any, one person is superior to the other. And Theaetetus here, who's sort of taken over the conversation now, says, yeah, that sounds right. And then Socrates continues, and about matters that concern the state too, things which are admirable or dishonorable, just or unjust, in conformity with religion or not. This is the best version of Protagoras' view, Heraclitus' view. It will hold that whatever sort of thing any state thinks to be and lays down as lawful for itself actually is, in strict truth, lawful for it. And that on these questions, no individual is at all any wiser than any other, and no state is at all any wiser than any other. So he's advocating this kind of relativism with cultural relativism with respect to what's admirable, just or unjust, conformity, or what's in conformity with religion or not. But then note what he says. But again, when it's a matter of a state's laying down what's advantageous or disadvantageous for it, it will admit that here, if anywhere, one advisor is superior to another, and the judgment of one state is superior in point of truth to the different judgment of another. It wouldn't have the face to say that whatever a state thinks to be and lays down as advantageous to itself will, whatever happens, actually be advantageous to itself. So for example, if a state is thinking of an economic policy and is trying to figure out, what's going to increase our GDP, right? They're not going to say like whatever they believe is actually going to increase their GDP. That's not relative. Socrates is saying here, you're going to recognize that there's an objective truth of the matter. But in that other sphere I was speaking of, in the case of what's just or unjust in conformity with religion or not, they're prepared to insist that none of them has by nature a being of its own. On the contrary, what seems to a community is in fact true at the time when it seems so, and for as long as it seems so. So Socrates is saying that this best version of Protagorean relativism is a form of cultural relativism about the just and the unjust, about what's in conformity with religion, about what is admirable or dishonorable. And this is the introduction to the digression, and we need to hold that in mind as we're reading through the digression. Okay, so the big picture in the digression is the contrast between the practical person and the philosopher. Now, let's just talk a little bit about views on the digression. So Gilbert Ryle thinks that, look, the digression is just Plato was too long in the Merlot hour. He was on his third glass of Merlot and just started writing and just forgot to delete this from the Theaetetus. Now, I don't think Plato would. So we can just say, okay, that's a view. Another view is that it's a footnote and should just be set aside. Now, two other views that I think are interesting is Chappell says that Plato here is reflecting on the way that character influences the evaluation of arguments. So Chappell says, perhaps the digression paints a picture of what it's like to live in accordance with the two different accounts of knowledge, the Protagorean and the Platonist, that Plato is comparing. Thus, the digression shows us what is ethically at stake in the often abstruse debates found elsewhere in the Theaetetus. Its point is that we can't make a decision about what account of knowledge to accept without making all sorts of other decisions, not only about the technical, logical, and metaphysical matters that are to the fore in the rest of the Theaetetus, but also about questions of deep ethical significance. So, for instance, it can hardly be an accident that in 176c, the difference between justice and injustice is said to be the difference between knowledge and ignorance. So I think that is definitely an aspect of what's going on here in the digression. Another view is that this is David Sedley, who has a wonderful book on the Theaetetus, says that this is Plato's response to the challenge of cultural relativism. So remember, that's just what happened. And so Plato here is providing a response to say, no, this philosophical life that's concerned with objective justice is the way to go. He's not offering an argument for it in the sense of premises and conclusion. He's painting a picture of what it is, right, to be concerned and to be, seeking out these principles of justice and how that influences one's character. So I want you to read the digression and let me know what you think about it. I think it's really just wonderful. It's a really wonderful presentation of the difference between a person whose constraints are very much limited by time and by the context in which they are, with a philosopher who is presented here as being unfettered in time and interest and able to explore issues as they occur to them. So before we turn to the final refutation of the claim that knowledge is perception, we get a refutation of Heraclitus' view that everything is in flux. This is, I think, interesting. So he says, look, if everything is in flux, then even the meanings of words are themselves constantly changing. But if that's true, then the thesis that everything is in flux can't itself be stated. The idea here is that there needs to be some sort of permanence in order to communicate and in order to, have a shared language. When we express a judgment that the stone is white, we're supposing that we're picking out a quality in the object that, in a sense, remains the same, that can be shared with other objects, that we can identify the same object over time. And so Plato's view here is that, look, if everything is constantly changing, then we can't get the kind of stability for meaning we need in order to just communicate, in order to state the thesis that everything is in flux. Now, Heraclitus is often compared to Buddhist philosophy. Buddhism has this view of impermanence, that nothing is permanent, that everything is constantly changing. Now, I will say that there are plenty of defenses of Heraclitus and the doctrine of impermanence here from this kind of Platonic criticism that if everything is constantly changing, then there's not even the kind of stability that's required for meaning. I'd point to, for example, Jay Garfield's fun, engaging book called Engaging Buddhism, which was published, I think, by Oxford in 2015. I'd encourage you to read it. The basic idea here is that while things are impermanent, they can change slow enough so that you can have shared meanings and that you can have the ability to sort of latch hold of things that are impermanent, but they're changing slow enough that, right, you can communicate. So we turn now to the final refutation of the thesis that knowledge is perception. This, I think, is a really fascinating argument that Plato gives. So he starts off with this idea that color is sensed by the eyes, sound by the ears, that the eye cannot hear sound and the ear cannot see colors. Now, what's going on here is he's thinking that the senses, in a way, get at sensory properties that are accessed through one particular sense. So colors are accessed by vision, not by audition. Right? Sounds are accessed by hearing, not by sight, not by feel, and so on. And he thinks that there's something special about the mind that unifies these diverse perceptions, that we can talk about colored objects. So the setup here is that the senses are giving us these particular sensations. And then Socrates says on 184d, he says, it would surely be strange if we had several senses sitting in us, as if in wooden horses, and it wasn't the case that all those things converged on some one kind of thing, a mind, or what one ought to call it, something something with which we perceive all the perceived things by means of the senses, as if by instruments. So suppose you have like a red ball that is bouncing on a desk or a floor before you. You not only see the red object, moving up and down, but you hear the contact that it's making as it hits the floor. And if you think about how is it that the mind is able to unify, right, those diverse perceptions in one object, a bouncing ball. If you think about the senses as giving us completely different information, right, it could be that we experience redness and we experience this sound, but they're not joined together in a common object. This is, in contemporary research on perception, this is known as the binding problem. What Plato is doing here is realizing that what Plato is doing here is he's pointing out that the senses give us particular information that's gleaned from one particular instrument, and there's something special going on that we're able to put these together in terms of objects. Now, one of the ways he does this is he highlights that there's some properties that are common to objects to the senses, so that we can say some things exist, some things don't exist, that we can say, well, that color, right, isn't real in some sense or another, or that color belongs to that object, or that is like this or unlike that, or the same and different, or they have number. There are two sounds here, and there's one color here, or there's two colors here, and there's two sounds here, so that they have, shared property in terms of number. He says these properties aren't perceived through the individual senses. So when we say that things exist, right, that's not something that is in a way perceived through the senses. That's something that the mind does. So he says that these must be considered by the soul functioning throughout itself without the aid of any special instrument. And then he concludes, so knowledge is located not in our experience, but in our reasonings about those things we mentioned, because it's possible, apparently, to grasp being and truth in the latter, but impossible in the former. So the way I think about this is I think that Plato here is pointing out that the senses themselves, right, aren't able to bind together that information in terms of common properties. We can talk about one ball, two balls, three balls, and so on, right? We need some capacity, not another instrument. We need some sort of general capacity to bind together these various perceptions to make them about one thing. So what I've tried to do here is present this in terms of an argument. So let's look at this argument. So first premise is that some sensory properties are experienced only by one sense. So we have the examples of color and sound. But some sensory properties can share properties. So we can talk about two colors and two sounds, and they have in common this number property. That number property isn't something that is experienced by any particular sense, right? Because you would have the same problem. One, you'd have the problem of locating like which particular sense discerns two. You would have the problem of trying to figure out what sense compares these two different sensations and so that they agree in number, right? That would have to be done by some sort of general power. So Plato reasons that the shared properties aren't grasped by individual senses. They need to be grasped by this general power, the mind or the soul. And so the idea is you get some knowledge that isn't sensory knowledge. The idea, again, here is that there's something going on in addition to the senses in generating perceptions of objects that have common properties. So it can't be that knowledge is purely perception. Now I want to just note there's an advantage to this dialectical strategy that Plato pursued. So he could have argued that there's mathematical knowledge and then just dismissed this thesis that knowledge is perception, but he granted this claim that knowledge is perception on its own merits, and then investigated features of perception that can't be accounted for in terms of just the senses. So that's a really powerful argumentative strategy. The conclusion of the argument is also supposed to support Plato's rationalism that there's something about the mind that contributes to knowledge. The mind provides us with these general categories: substance, which is being and non-being; number, things being alike and different, and so on. So we'll see how this works out later in some of Plato's thoughts in the Theaetetus. So what we're going to turn to next is Theaetetus's argument that knowledge is true belief. That's going to be rejected, and then an argument that knowledge is justified true belief. That itself is going to be objected. Along the way, we're going to have some really interesting puzzles that Socrates is going to give us, that Plato is going to give us. We're going to puzzle about false belief. How is false belief possible? We're going to get different models of memory. We're going to talk about the wax tablet. We're going to talk about the mind as an aviary. And we're going to look at Socrates' dream theory. Now, this, I think, this argument that we just looked at, and then the arguments that we're going to talk about later in the Theaetetus, I think are just really, really philosophically fascinating. So I do hope that you are enjoying this, that you're learning a lot. Ask me questions over email. As you're thinking about your papers, the Theaetetus is ripe with many issues to investigate. So if you're interested in all this, send me an email. I'll send you references to papers, and I'll send you references to papers that you can look up. So I hope you guys are really enjoying this, and look forward to talking to you soon.